Hello, welcome back to my YouTube channel. In the video today, I'm going to be painting this table behind. It's a coffee table. It's also a sold order, so this is a commission that my customer has basically chosen this from my inventory, and I do have a very large inventory because I've got a furniture addiction. And they chose it. I know exactly what I need to do to it. I've got my instructions, I've got my colour palette. It's going to be mustard, it's going to be yellows, it's going to be aged, it's going to be distressed, it's going to be all the things. And it's going to end up in France. As always, going to start with a good old scrub because this piece is a second-hand piece of furniture. It doesn't really have any age to it, so there's no kind of issues there. It's just a little bit dirty. It's been in my storage unit for a couple of months, and eagle-eyed viewers may spot some paint on the top which I dripped on. So I'm going to sand that off to make sure that that isn't visible, and then just gave the piece a little scuff sand all over once it had been cleaned and rinsed. So that's been cleaned, dried, scuff sanded with my electric sander, and then the next thing I'm going to do is use Bond Emboss. Now, you've seen me use this product before. I usually use grey, sometimes white, but I'm going to use clear today, and here's the reason why. Lots of people ask, what is the purpose of clear? So the purpose of clear, there's a few different uses for it, but the main one being is if you want to distress your piece and you want to see hints of the wood coming through, which this piece is going to be, then clear is very, very good for that. Obviously, if I was to paint this mustard and then distress it and I'd painted white or grey underneath, you could see little bits of that primer peeking through. This is not going to do that. When I distress the mustard, it's just going to show wood. The other thing this is really good for is if you've gone ahead and painted and you don't feel like you're going to have any bleed through, and you've got bleed through. You've already got a paint coat on or two and the dreaded bleed through is occurring. Then you can go ahead and use your clear Bond Emboss. That will stop and lock in any further bleed through, and then you can go ahead and paint on another coat of paint as usual. That way you're not going backwards a step using a white or grey primer and then having to apply paint again. So it's saving you paint in the long run. So that is a really couple of good uses that you can use clear Bond Emboss for. So usually when I'm painting a piece of furniture, I always flip it upside down and start with the bottom. That way you can just flip it back on its feet and paint the rest. If I'd painted the top first, I wouldn't be able to flip it up and then do the bottom. I'd have to wait for it all to dry, flip it up, you risk scratching the paint. Obviously I'm only priming at this stage, but you get the drift. So I've flipped it on its side and I just need to decide where the paint is going to finish. So obviously I'm going to paint the legs. The clearance of this piece is it's very low to the ground, so there's not a lot of clearance. It's unlikely anybody will see underneath here, but just in case anybody does want to shove their head under the coffee table, I'm going to paint this lip around here. That's just how I'm just going to finish this. There's absolutely no right and wrong answer. It depends on the piece. If your piece is sitting on the floor, no need painting the underneath. But if the underneath is going to be visible at any point, I do like to paint it because I just feel like it looks nice and professional. So I'm going to prime this with the clear Bond Emboss. Obviously it's clear. You can sort of see it going on because it's kind of like a hazy finish, like a milky finish when it goes on, but it dries completely clear. There is also a little bit on the leg which sort of needs taping off a little bit, just there, because otherwise I'm going to have to take the paint up here and there's absolutely no point because it's underneath the piece. So on each leg I'm just going to use a little bit of masking tape and just tape off so it's got a nice straight edge and it's finished off nicely. So that's one coat of the clear Bond Emboss done on the underneath. I just need to leave that to dry before I can do a second coat, and then I can flip it over, do the rest of the piece in the Bond Emboss, and then let it dry, and then in 24 hours time it'll be ready to paint. Just a little trick that I do, if I know I'm coming back to a piece that need a second coat of something that I've just done, rather than keep washing all my brushes out, I'll just get a bag or cling film and shove the brush in the bag, Make sure it's airtight. Make sure there's no air can get in that. So put a rubber band around it or whatever. Some people keep it in the fridge. I don't. I'm in the UK. It's not hot. So I just make sure it's no air can get into it. And then it saves me having to wash all my brushes out all the time. Once I've done a second coat to the underneath of this piece, I could then flip it over and use the clear primer over the rest of the piece, the top and the sides. And this bond emboss is no different to other bond embosses that I've used. Obviously, it's just that this is clear and there are grey and white options as well, so that you can just decide which colour's best depending on the kind of project that you're using. So you do need to do 2 to 3 coats and then leave it 24 hours to dry. So we'll skip forwards. 24 hours has passed and now I'm going to paint it. So I'm going to not paint this in a one colour finish. It's going to have a very subtle blend to give it a little bit of dimension. And this is the piece now that this piece is kind of based on, the paint finish. It's a piece that I did absolutely years ago and I showed it to my customer and she was like, yes, I like it because it adds a little bit of dimension to an otherwise flat finish. So obviously this piece has got some very flat edges. Even the front where the drawers are completely flat. There's no real detail on it apart from the metal pieces on the corner. So I'm going to start out with a base of Colonel Mustard with a little bit of pine cone mixed in, and that's just going to mute the colour down slightly. My second coat is where I'm going to blend. Now there's loads of different ways that you can blend paint together. This is just one example and it's just the way that I prefer for this particular piece. So I've already put my base colour down and that's just one coat of the Colonel Mustard mixed with a little bit of pine cone. The second coat, I'm not going to completely fill that top space with the mustardy kind of yellow. I just left a little window in the centre, which is where I'm going to put a lighter yellow. You could use white as well. This would have a very similar effect. The piece that I showed before actually was white in the centre. This is called Rebel Yellow and they're going to blend together and give a very kind of similar finish. But if you are new to blending, it is worth noting that 2 colours that are very similar are going to be easier to blend than 2 colours that are completely opposite. So 2 different shades of yellow are going to blend together a lot easier than yellow and blue, for example. You could still do it, it's just easier to blend tonal colours together. So as you noticed, I laid down a little spritz of water first. I added my darker mustard around the edges, left a window in the centre, applied with a separate brush the Rebel Yellow, which is a very pale kind of pastel yellow, and then I'm using a little bit more water, not too much. You don't want this thing dripping because your paint will just be sliding and slipping all over the place. And then I'm using the Big Daddy brush. Now as you can see, this is a big flat brush. I actually prefer this way of blending, especially if you've got a large flat space, as opposed to using the Best Dang brush, which I have used in the past. And then all you do is use a super light hand and just melt those colours together. I want this to kind of be a little bit of a smoky blend, so I don't want a perfectly seamless blend. The same goes on the sides and the front. I'm just going to show you those because it's the same technique, although I've applied it slightly differently because I want the highlighted areas on the drawer front. So wherever you want that highlighted area, don't add paint of your darker colour, just add a little dab of your lighter colour and then just really gently blend it out. The magic of this piece, because my customer specifically asked for aging and to make it look like the piece had been knocking around for years. So the magic of this piece is going to be the kind of finishing up, if you like, the finishing touches, the distressing and the waxing. That is what is going to add all the age and dimension. And as you know, I love doing faux finishes that are kind of that aged and kind of grungy or chippy look. So I love a bit of distressing. It's not for everyone, but for me personally, it's something that I really like doing. I love seeing old chippy pieces and I like to replicate that as close as I can. So what I'm doing now is distressing, obviously, the dried paint. I skip very quickly on from blending to distressing because that is basically all I did. All in between happened is the paint obviously dried. I let it dry overnight. and the longer you leave your paint to dry, the harder it is to distress, because obviously over time it hardens and cures. So I'm using two different things here. I'm using a 120 grit sandpaper off my Festool sander, and then I'm using Dixie Belle's sanding sponge. So what I'll do is I'll first go on with the more coarse grit sandpaper and take off the paint that I don't want. So I've gone around all the edges of the coffee table, around the edges of the drawers, and I've also heavily distressed the corner pieces, which are those metal pieces, because my customer did want to see that metal work, but I felt like if I didn't paint over it and then distress it, it would just look too clean looking. So I intentionally painted over that metal work and then took the majority off with my sandpaper and just left it in kind of the nooks and crannies. And never forget the legs. If you are distressing something, never forget the bottom and the legs, because the legs would be what got the most amount of wear and tear. If this was a genuinely aged or chippy piece, the legs get bashed a lot. So I went in again with the coarse sandpaper first, and then worked down to the finer grit sandpaper, the sanding sponge, which is equivalent to a 220 grit. Once everything was distressed to the level that I wanted it, I had to seal the project and offer some kind of protection and durability. Usually, if you've watched my stuff before, you'll know that I like my waxes. However, I wanted something a little bit more durable for this because it's a coffee table, so it's likely to have items placed on the top and drinks and so on. So I'm using Terra Tough, which is a top coat that's been specially formulated to be used with Terra clay paint, but it can also be used on other paints as well. So I'm using it here over the chalk mineral paint that I've obviously just used, and it's a really lovely top coat. I like how it applies, and I like the sheen level and everything, so that's why I use it quite a lot. And as you can see, I'm alternating the direction in which I'm applying the top coat. So I did 3 coats in total of this. The first coat I worked left to right. This time I'm working front to back, and the third coat, which I didn't film for some reason, again I went left to right. Then when it was completely dry, and I'm talking leave it at least 24 hours to make sure it's fully dry, then I went in, and this is what's really going to bring it all together, because my customer wanted mustardy umbery colour. Obviously at the minute it is quite mustardy. Obviously I've used Colonel Mustard, but it is still looking like quite clean, and without that little bit of shading in the middle, it would have looked quite one-dimensional. It's quite a bulky, blocky piece. So this is just going to give a lot more tonal variation, and it's going to help break up that kind of wide expanse of yellow. I'm using Best Dang Wax in brown. I'm going in heavy. We're going in heavy with the brown wax. I'm using the Best Dang brush, and I'm just concentrating the majority of the product around the edges of the coffee table. And then once I've placed that around the edge, I'm just going to use what's left on the brush and kind of swirl it into the centre, because sometimes if you don't add it everywhere, it kind of looks a little bit like there's a harsh line where the wax suddenly starts, if that makes sense, and there's kind of nothing in between. So I like to apply it heavily in some areas and then very lightly in others, and that just gives you a sense that the piece is it works together. Whereas if sometimes you just put wax in edges, it kind of just looks a little bit forced and a little bit contrived. So this is just my personal preference. So I'm adding, again, this is just a different view, but it's the same kind of thing, slightly different brush, because this brush is going to give me slightly more accuracy than the Best Dang brush, because it's got a smaller surface area. They're both natural bristle brushes, which is what I prefer to apply wax with. And I'm just putting the majority of the wax around the edges of the drawers. This looks very intense and very kind of shocking and dirty. But when you've applied it on, you leave it for about half an hour, and then you come in with a microfiber cloth or a rag, and then you wipe the excess off. So this works it into the kind of texture. Obviously this piece is very rustic, it's handmade. There's a lot of dings and kind of imperfections to the surface, which is exactly what my customer wanted. So by kind of buffing it off, you're just leaving that little hint of wax in the kind of recessed areas, and then where I've built it up more intensely, it just adds that dimension and shading. You can also layer waxes as well, so if you wanted to go in with a second coat of wax, you can absolutely do that, and that's better to do than trying to put it on really thickly in one coat. Build it up in layers as if you were painting a couple of coats of paint. It's exactly the same kind of idea. And here's what the piece looked like when it was all finished and staged. That's the top. As you can see, it just gives you a little bit more dimension to the finish. There's a little close-up of the distress work, and I haven't done a typical outro of this because I was so excited to finish it and stage it, and I packed it all away and I realised I hadn't filmed an outro. So there's the finished piece. Hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll catch you next time. Something in my eyeball. Wiggle, wiggle. Down. Going up. Higher. And it's got a very, it just depends on the piece. That's my dog having a drink. This microphone picks up everything. Sounds disgusting. When you're finished. I think she's done. Nope. It's fine. We'll wait for you. It's not a problem. There you go. She's gone back and lay down now. As I was saying, so that's, oh, got a drip. So that's two, that's not 2 coats, that's 1 coat. In the, nobody wants that, do they?